Hello, friendos, and welcome to the epic conclusion of the Hellbound Heart, the small little novella that started the Hellraiser horror film franchise. My name is That Dante, that D4NT3 on the internets, and today we're going to be starting off at chapter 8, and we're almost to the end of the little novella, so this should be a fairly short stream. Let me go back a few pages here. When we last left our cast here, Julia had just given Frank his latest victim to help him get back to who he was, and they were having a little conversation about that. And so we're going to move on from there. Let's get some background music happening here. So, here we go. There was thunder that night, a storm without rain, which made the air smell of steel. Kirsty had never slept well. Even as a child, though her mother had known lullabies enough to pacify nations, the girl had never found slumber easy. It wasn't that she had bad dreams, or at least none that lingered until morning. It was that sleep itself, the act of closing the eyes and relinquishing control of her consciousness, was something she was temperamentally unsuited to. Tonight, with the thunder so loud and the lightning so bright, she was happy. She had an excuse to forsake her tangled bed and drink tea and watch the spectacle from her window. It gave her time to think as well, time to turn over the problem that had vexed her since leaving the house on Lodovico Street, but she was still no nearer an answer. One particular doubt nagged. Suppose she was wrong about what she'd seen. Suppose she'd misconstructed the evidence and Julia had a perfectly good explanation. She would lose Rory at a stroke. And yet, how could she remain silent? She couldn't bear to think of the woman laughing behind his back, exploiting his gentility, his naivety. The thought made her blood boil. The only other option was to wait and watch, to see if she could gain some incontrovertible evidence. If her worst suppositions were then confirmed, she would have no choice but to tell Rory all she'd seen. Yes, that was the answer. Wait and watch. Watch and wait. The thunder rolled around for long hours, denying her sleep until nearly 4. When finally she did sleep, it was the slumber of a watcher and waiter, light and full of sighs. The storm made a ghost train of the house. Julia sat downstairs and counted the beats between the flash and the fury that came on its heels. She had never liked thunder. She, a murderess. She, a consorter with the living dead. It was another paradox to add to the 1,000 she'd found at work in herself of late. She thought more than once of going upstairs and taking some comfort with the prodigy, but knew that it would be unwise. Rory might return at any moment from his office party. He would be drunk on past experience and full of unwelcome fondness. The storm crept closer. She put on the television to block out the din, which it scarcely did. At 11, Rory came home, wreathed in smiles. He had good news. In the middle of the party, his supervisor had taken him aside, commended him for his excellent work, and spoken of great things for the future. Julia listened to his retelling of the exchange, hoping that his inebriation would blind him to her indifference. At last, his news told, he threw off his jacket and sat down on the sofa beside her. "Poor you," he said. "You don't like the thunder." "I'm fine," she said. "Are you sure?" "Yes, fine." He leaned across to her and nuzzled her ear. "You're sweaty," she said matter-of-factly. Oh, that's her. "You're sweaty," she said matter-of-factly. He didn't cease his overtures, however, unwilling to lower his baton now that he'd begun. "Please, Rory," she said. "I don't want this." "Why not? What did I do?" "Nothing," she said, pretending some interest in the television. "You're fine." "Oh, is that right?" he said. "You're fine, I'm fine, everybody's fucking fine." She stared at the flickering screen. The late evening news had just begun. The usual cup of sorrow was full to brimming. Rory talked on, drowning out the newscaster's voice with his diatribe. She didn't much mind. What did the world have to tell her? Little enough. Whereas she had news for the world that it would reel to hear. About the condition of the damned, about love lost and then found, about what despair and desire have in common. Please, Julia, Rory was saying, just speak to me. The please demanded her attention. He looked, she thought, like the boy in the photographs. His body, hirsute and bloated. His clothes, those of an adult, but still in essence a boy, with his bewildered gaze and sulky mouth. She remembered Frank's question. How could you ever have married such a dullard? Thinking of it, a sour smile creased her lips. He looked at her, his puzzlement deepening. What's so funny, damn you? Nothing. He shook his head, dull anger replacing the sulk. A peal of thunder followed the lightning with barely a beat intervening. As it came, there was a noise from the floor above. She turned her attention back to the television to divert Rory's interest, but it was a vain attempt. He'd heard the sound. What the fuck was that? Thunder? He stood up. No, he said. Something else. He was already at the door. A dozen options raced through her head, none of them practical. He wrestled drunkenly with the door handle. Maybe I left a window open. Maybe I left a window. Okay, that's her. Maybe I left a window open, she said, and got up. I'll go and see. Julia in the film, Hellraiser, is British, so I'm going to try and give her British accents when I read her stuff. So I'm sorry, people from Britain. It's going to be cheesy. I can do it, he replied. I'm not totally inept. Nobody said, she began, but he wasn't listening. As he stepped out into the hallway, the lightning came with the thunder, loud and bright. As she went in pursuit of him, another flash came fast upon the first, accompanied by a bow-rocking crash. Rory was already halfway up the stairs. It was nothing, she shouted after him. He made no reply, but climbed onto the top of the stairs. She followed. Don't, she said to him, in a lull between one peal and the next. He heard her this time, or rather chose to listen. When she reached the top of the stairs, he was waiting. Something wrong? He said. She hid her trepidation behind a shrug. You're being silly, she replied softly. Am I? It was just the thunder. His face, lit from the hall below, suddenly softened. Why do you treat me like shit? He asked her. You're just tired, she told him. Why, though? He persisted, childlike. What have I ever done to you? It's all right, she said. Really, Rory, everything's all right. The same hypnotic banalities over and over. Again the thunder, and beneath the din another sound. She cursed Frank's indiscretion. Rory turned and looked along the darkened landing. Hear that? He said. No? His limbs dogged by drink, he moved away from her. She watched him recede into shadow. Lightning spilling through the open bedroom door, flash lit him. Then darkness again. He was walking toward the damp room, toward Frank. Wait, she said, and went after him. He didn't halt, but covered the few yards to the door. As she reached him, his hand was closing on the handle. Inspired by panic, she reached out and touched his cheek. I'm afraid, she said. He looked around at her woozily. What of? He asked her. She moved her hand to his lips, letting him taste the fear on her fingers. The storm, she said. She could see the wetness of his eyes in the gloom, little more. Was he swallowing the hook or spitting it out? Then, poor baby, he said. Swallowed, she elated, and reaching down, she put her hand over his and drew it from the door. If Frank so much as breathed now, all was lost. Poor baby, he said again, and wrapped an embrace around her. His balance was not too good. He was a lead weight in her arms. Come on, she said, coaxing him away from the door. He went with her for a couple of stumbling paces and then lost his equilibrium. She let go of him and reached out to the wall for support. The lightning came again, and by it she saw that his eyes had found her and glittered. I love you, he said, stepping across the hallway to where she stood. He pressed against her so heavily that there was no resisting. His head went to the crook of her neck, muttering sweet talk into her skin. Now he was kissing her. She wanted to throw him off. More, she wanted to take him by his clammy hand and show him the death-defying monster he'd been so close to stumbling across. But Frank wasn't ready for that confrontation. Not yet. All she could do was endure Rory's caresses and hope that exhaustion claimed him quickly. "Why don't we go downstairs?" she suggested. He muttered something into her neck and didn't move. His left hand was on her breast, the other clasped around her waist. She let him work his fingers beneath her blouse. To resist at this juncture would only inflame him afresh. "I need you," he said, raising his mouth to her ear. Once, half a lifetime ago, her heart had seemed to skip at such a profession. Now she knew better. Her heart was no acrobat. There was no tingle in the coils of her abdomen, only the steady workings of her body. Breath drawn, blood circulated, food pulped and purged. Thinking of her anatomy thus, untainted by romanticism, as a collection of natural imperatives housed in muscle and bone, she found it easier to let him strip her blouse and put his face to her breasts. Her nerve endings dutifully responded to his tongue, but again it was merely an anatomy lesson. She stood back in the dome of her skull and was unmoved. He was unbuttoning himself now. She caught sight of the boastful plum as he stroked it against her thigh. Now he opened her legs and pulled her underwear down just far enough to give him access. She made no objection, nor even a sound as he made his entrance. His own den began almost immediately, feeble claims to love and lust, hopelessly tangled together. She half listened and let him work at his play, his face buried in her hair. Closing her eyes, she tried to picture better times, but the lightning spoiled her dreaming. As sound followed light, she opened her eyes again to see that the door of the damp room had been opened 2 or 3 inches. In the narrow gap between the door and frame, she could just make out a glistening figure watching them. She could not see Frank's eyes, but she felt them sharpened beyond pricking by envy and rage. Nor did she look away, but stared on at the shadow while Rory's moans increased. And at the end one moment became another, and she was lying on the bed with her wedding dress crushed beneath her, while a black and scarlet beast crept up between her legs to give her a sample of its love. "Poor baby," was the last thing Rory said as sleep overcame him. He lay on the bed, still dressed. She made no attempt to strip him. When his snores were even, she left him to it, and went back to the room. Frank was standing beside the window, watching the storm move to the southeast. He had torn the blind away. Lamplight washed the walls. He heard you, she said. "I had to see the storm," he replied simply. "I needed it." "He almost found you, damn it." Frank shook his head. "There's no such thing as almost," he said, still staring out at the window. Then after a pause, "I want to be out there. I want to have it all again." "I know." "No, you don't," he told her. "You've no conception of the hunger I've got in me." "Tomorrow, then," she said. "I'll get another body tomorrow." "Yes, you do that. And I want some other stuff. A radio, for one. I want to know what's going on out there. And food. Proper food. Fresh bread. Whatever you need. And ginger. The preserved kind, you know, in syrup." "I know." He glanced around at her briefly, but he wasn't seeing her. There was too much world to be reacquainted with tonight. "I didn't realize it was autumn," he said, and went back to watching the storm. Chapter 9. The first thing Kirsty noticed when she came around the corner of Lodovico Street the following day was that the blind had gone from the upper front window. Sheets of newspaper had been taped against the glass in its place. She found herself a vantage point in the shelter of a holly hedge, from which she hoped she could watch the house but remain unseen. Then she settled down for her vigil. It was not quickly rewarded. 2 hours and more went by before she saw Julia leave the house. Another hour and a quarter before she returned, by which time Kirsty's feet were numb with cold. Julia had not returned alone. The man she was with was not known to Kirsty, nor indeed did he look to be a likely member of Julia's circle. From a distance he appeared to be in middle age, stocking, balding. When he followed Julia into the house, and he gave a nervous backward glance, as if fearful of voyeurs. She waited in her hiding place for a further quarter of an hour, not certain of what to do next. Did she linger here until the man emerged and challenged him, or did she go to the house and try to talk her way inside? Neither option was particularly attractive. She decided not to decide. Instead, she would get closer to the house, and see what inspiration the moment brought. The answer was very little. As she made her way up the path, her feet itched to turn and carry her away. Indeed, she was within an ace of doing so. She was an ace of doing just that when she heard a shout from within. The man's name was Sykes, Stanley Sykes. Nor was that all he'd told Julia on the way back from the bar. She knew his wife's name, Maudie, an occupation, assistant chiropodist. She'd had pictures of the children Rebecca and Ethan provided for her to coo over. The man seemed to be defying her to continue the seduction. She merely smiled and told him he was a lucky man. But once in the house, things had begun to go awry. Halfway up the stairs, friend Sykes had suddenly announced that what they were doing was wrong, that God saw them and knew their hearts and found them wanting. She had done her best to calm him, but he was not to be won back from the Lord. Instead, he lost his temper and flailed loud at her. He might have done worse in his righteous wrath, but for the voice that had called him from the landing. He'd stopped hitting her instantly and became so pale, it was as if he believed God himself was doing the calling. Then Frank had appeared at the top of the stairs in all his glory. Sykes had loosed a cry and tried to run, but Julia was quick. She had her hand on him long enough for Frank to descend the few stairs and make a permanent arrest. She had not realized until she heard the creak and snap of bone as Frank took hold of his prey how strong he had become of late, stronger surely than a natural man. At Frank's touch, Sykes had shouted again. To silence him, Frank wrenched off his jaw. The second shout that Kirsty had heard had ended abruptly, but she read enough panic into the den to have her at the door and on the verge of knocking. Only then did she think better of it. Instead, she slipped down the side of the house, doubting with every step the wisdom of this, but equally certain that a frontal assault would get her nowhere. The gate that had offered access to the back garden was lacking a bolt. She slipped through, her ears alive to every sound, especially that of her own feet. From the house, nothing, not so much as a moan. Leaving the gate open in case she should need a quick retreat, she hurried to the back door. It was unlocked. This time she let doubt slow her step. Maybe she should go and call Rory, bring him to the house, but by that time, whatever was happening inside would be over, and she knew damn well that unless Julia was caught red-handed, she would slide from under any accusation. No, this was the only way. She stepped inside. The house remained completely quiet. There was not even a footfall to help her locate the actors she'd come to view. She moved to the kitchen door, and from there through to the dining room. Her stomach twitched. Her throat was suddenly so dry she could barely swallow. From dining room to lounge, and thence into the hallway. Still nothing, no whisper or sigh. Julia and her companion could only be upstairs, which suggested that she had been wrong, thinking she heard fear in the shouts. Perhaps it was pleasure that she'd heard, an orgasmic whoop instead of the terror she'd taken it for. It was an easy mistake to make. The front door was on her right, mere yards away. She could still slip out and away, the coward in her tempted, and no one would be any the wiser. But a fierce curiosity had seized her, a desire to know, to see the mysteries the house held, and be done with them. As she climbed the stairs, the curiosity mounted to a kind of exhilaration. She reached the top and began to make her way along the landing. The thought occurred now that the birds had flown, that while she had been creeping through from the back of the house, they had left via the front. The first door on the left was the bedroom. If they were mating anywhere, Julia and her paramour, it would surely be here. But no. The door stood ajar. She peered in. The bedspread was uncreased. Then a misshapen cry, so near, so loud, her heart missed its rhythm. She ducked out of the bedroom to see a figure lurch from one of the rooms farther along the landing. It took her a moment to recognize the fretful man who had arrived with Julia, and only then by his clothes. The rest was changed, horribly changed. A wasting disease had seized him in the minutes since she'd seen him on the step, shriveling his flesh on the bone. Seeing Kirsty, he threw himself toward her, seeking what fragile protection she could offer. He had got no more than a pace from the door, however, when a form spilled into sight behind him. It too seemed diseased, its body bandaged from head to foot, the binding stained by issues of blood and pus. There was nothing in its speed, however, or the ferocity of its subsequent attack that suggested sickness. Quite the reverse. It reached for the fleeing man and took hold of him by the neck. Kirsty let out a cry as the captor drew its prey back into its embrace. The victim made what little complaint his dislocated face was capable of. Then the antagonist tightened its embrace. The body trembled and twitched, its legs buckled. Blood spurted from eyes and nose and mouth. Spots of it filled the air like hot hail, breaking against her brow. The sensation snapped her from her inertia. This was no time to wait and watch. She ran. The monster made no pursuit. She reached the top of the stairs without being overtaken, but as her foot descended, it addressed her. Its voice was familiar. "There you are," it said. It spoke with melting tones, as if it knew her. She stopped. "Kirsty," it said, "wait a while." Her head told her to run. Her gut defied the wisdom, however. It wanted to remember whose voice this was, speaking from the binding. She could still make good her escape, she reasoned. She had an 8-yard start. She looked around at the figure. The body and its arms had curled up, fatally, legs against the chest. The beast dropped it. "You killed him," she said. The thing nodded. It had no apologies to make, apparently, to either victim or witness. "We'll mourn him later," it told her, and took a step toward her. "Where's Julia?" Kirsty demanded. "Don't you fret. All's well," the voice said. She was so close to remembering who it was. As she puzzled, it took another step, one hand upon the wall, as if its balance was still uncertain. "I saw you," it went on, "and I think you saw me at the window." Her mystification increased. Had this thing been in the house that long? If so, surely Rory must, and then she knew the voice. "Yes, you do remember." "Oh no, that's him. Yes, you do remember. I can see you remember." It was Rory's voice, or rather, a close approximation of it. More guttural, more self-regarding, but the resemblance was uncanny enough to keep her rooted to the spot, while the beast shambled within snatching distance of her. At the last, she recanted her fascination and turned to flee, but the cause was already lost. She heard it step a pace behind her, then felt its fingers at her neck. A cry came to her lips, but it was barely mounted before the thing had its corrugated palm across her face, canceling both shout and the breath it came upon. It plucked her up and took her back the way she'd come. In vain she struggled against its hold, the small wounds her fingers made upon its body, tearing at the bandages and digging into the rawness beneath, left it entirely unmoved, it seemed. For a horrid moment her heels snagged the corpse on the floor. Then she was being hauled into the room from which the living and the dead had emerged. It smelled of soured milk and fresh meat. When she was flung down, the boards beneath her were wet and warm. Her belly wanted to turn inside out. She didn't fight the instinct, but retched up all that her stomach held. In the confusion of present discomfort and anticipated terror, she was not certain of what happened next. Did she glimpse somebody else, Julia, on the landing as the door was slammed? Or was it Shadow? One way or another, it was too late for appeals. She was alone with the nightmare. Wiping the bile from her mouth, she got to her feet. Daylight pierced the newspaper at the window here and there, dappling the room like sunlight through branches. And through this pastoral, the thing came sniffing her. "Come to Daddy," it said. In her 26 years, she had never heard an easier invitation to refuse. "Don't touch me," she told it. It cocked its head a little, as if charmed by this show of propriety. Then it closed in on her, all pus and laughter, and, God help her, desire. She backed a few desperate inches into the corner until there was nowhere else for her to go. "Don't you remember me?" it said. She shook her head. "Frank," came the reply. "This is Brother Frank." She had met Frank only once at Alexandra Road. He'd come visiting one afternoon just before the wedding. More she couldn't recall, except that she'd hated him on sight. "Leave me alone," she said as it reached for her. There was a vile finesse in the way his stained fingers touched her breast. "Don't," she shrieked, "or so help me." "What?" said Rory's voice. What will you do? Nothing, was the answer, of course. She was helpless, as only she had ever been in dreams, those dreams of pursuit and assault that her psyche had always staged on a ghetto street in some eternal night. Never, not even in her most witless fantasies, had she anticipated that the arena would be a room she had walked past a dozen times, in a house where she had been happy, while outside the day went on as ever, gray on gray. In a futile gesture of disgust, she pushed the investigating hand away. Don't be cruel, the thing said, and his fingers found her skin again, as unchewable as October wasps. Ooh, nice. What's to be frightened of? Outside, she began, thinking of the horror on the landing. A man has to eat, Frank replied. Surely you can forgive me that. Why did she even feel his touch, she wondered. Why didn't her nerves share her disgust and die beneath his caress? This isn't happening, she told herself aloud, but the beast only laughed. I used to tell myself that, he said. Day in, day out, used to try and dream the agonies away. But you can't. Take it from me, you can't. They have to be endured. She knew he was telling the truth, the kind of unsavory truth that only monsters were at liberty to tell. He had no need to flatter or cajole. He had no philosophy to debate or sermon to deliver. His awful nakedness was a kind of sophistication, past the lies of faith and into purer realms. She knew too well that she would not endure, that when her pleadings faltered and Frank claimed her for whatever vileness he had in mind, she would loose such a scream that she would shatter. Her very sanity was at stake here. She had no choice but to fight back, and quickly. Before Frank had a chance to press his suit any harder, her hands went up to his face, fingers gouging at his eye holes and mouth. The flesh beneath the bandage had the consistency of jelly. It came away in globes, and with it a wet heat. The beast shouted out, his grip on her relaxing. Seizing the moment, she threw herself out from under him, the momentum carrying her against the wall with enough force to badly wind her. Again Frank roared. She didn't waste time enjoying his discomfort, but slid along the wall, not trusting her legs sufficiently to move into open territory toward the door. As she advanced, her feet sent an unlidden jar of preserved ginger rolling across the room, spilling syrup and fruit alike. Frank turned toward her, the bandaging about his face hanging in scarlet loops where she'd torn it away. In several places the bone was exposed. Even now he ran his hands over the wounds, roars of horror coming as he sought to measure the degree of his maiming. I got lost. Here we go. Had she blinded him? She wasn't sure. Even if she had, it was only a matter of time before he located her in this small room, and when he did, his rage would know no bounds. She had to reach the door before he reoriented himself. Faint hope! She hadn't a moment to take a step before he dropped his hands from his face and scanned the room. He saw her, no doubt of that. A beat later, he was bearing down upon her with renewed violence. At her feet lay a lifter of domestic items. The heaviest item among them was a plain box. She reached down and picked it up. As she stood upright, he was upon her. She loosed a cry of defiance and swung the box-bearing fist at his head. It connected heavily, bones splintered. The beast tottered backwards, and she launched herself toward the door, but before she reached it, the shadow swamped her once more, and she was flung backwards across the room. It came in a raging pursuit. This time, he had no intention beyond the murderous. His lashes were intended kill. Where was I? Oh, there we are. That they did not was testament less to her speed than to the imprecision of his fury. Nevertheless, 1 out of 3 blows caught her. Gashes opened in her face and upper chest. It was all she could do to prevent herself from fainting. As she sank beneath his assault, again she remembered the weapon she'd found. The box was still in her hand. She raised it to deliver another blow, but as Frank's eyes came to rest on the box, his assault abruptly ceased. There was a panting respite, in which Kirsty had a chance to wonder if death might not be easier than further flight. Then Frank raised his arm toward her, unfurled his fist, and said, "Give it to me." He wanted his keepsake, it seemed, but she had no intention of relinquishing her only weapon. "No," she said. He made the demand a second time, and there was a distinct anxiety in his tone. It seemed the box was too precious for him to risk taking it by force. "One last time," he said to her. "Then I'll kill you. Give me the box." She weighed the chances. What had she left to lose? "Say please," she said. He regarded her quizzically, a soft growl in his throat. Then, polite as a calculating child, he said, "Please?" The word was her cue. She threw the box at the window with all the strength her trembling arm possessed. It sailed past Frank's head, shattering the glass, and disappeared from sight. "No!" he shrieked, and was at the window in a heartbeat. "No! No! No!" She raced to the door, her legs threatening to fail her with every step. Then she was out onto the landing. The stairs almost defeated her, but she clung to the banister like a geriatric and made it to the hallway without falling. Above, there was further den. He was calling after her again, but this time she would not be caught. She fled along the hallway to the front door and flung it open. The day had brightened since she first entered the house, a defiant burst of sunlight before evening fell. Squinting against the glare, she stared down the pathway. There was glass underfoot, and amongst the shards, her weapon. She picked it up, a souvenir of her defiance, and ran. As she reached the street proper, words began to come, a hopeless babble, fragments of things seen and felt. But Lodovico Street was deserted, so she began to run, and kept running until she had to put a good distance between her and the bandaged beast. Eventually, wandering on some street she didn't recognize, somebody asked her if she needed help. The little kindness defeated her, for the effort of making some coherent reply to the inquiry was too much, and her exhausted mind lost its hold on the light. Chapter 10. She woke in a blizzard, or such was her first impression. Above her, a perfect whiteness, snow on snow. She was tucked up in snow, pillowed in snow. The blankness was sickening. It seemed to fill up her throat and eyes. She raised her hands in front of her face. They smelled of an unfamiliar soap, whose perfume was harsh. Now she began to focus. The walls, the pristine sheets, the medication beside the bed. A hospital. She called out for help. Hours or minutes later, she wasn't sure which, it came in the form of a nurse who simply said, "You're awake," and went to fetch her superiors. Hey, Olympic Couch, we're doing a little reading here. She called out for help. Hours or minutes later, she wasn't sure. I'm just repeating this. It came from the form of a nurse who simply said, "You're awake," and went to fetch her superiors. She told them nothing when they came. She had decided in the time between the nurse's disappearance and reappearance with the doctors that this was not a story she was ready to tell. Tomorrow, maybe, she might find the words to convince them of what she'd seen. But today, if she tried to explain, they would stroke her brow and tell her to hush her nonsense, condescend to her, and try to persuade her she was hallucinating. If she pressed the point, they'd probably sedate her, which would make matters worse. What she needed was time to think. All of this she'd worked out before they arrived, so that when they asked her what had happened, she had her lies ready. It was all a fog, she told them. She could barely remember her own name. It will come back in time, they reassured her, and she replied meekly that she supposed it would. Sleep now, they said, and she told them she'd be happy to do just that, and yawned. They withdrew then. "Oh yes," said one of them as he was about to go. "I forgot." He brought Frank's box from his pocket. "You were holding on to this when you were found. We had the devil's own job getting it out of your hand. Does it mean anything to you?" She said it didn't. "The police have looked at it. There was blood on it, you see. Maybe yours, maybe not." He approached the bed. "Do you want it?" he asked her, then added, It has been cleaned." "Yes," she replied. "Yes, please." "It may jog your memory," he told her, and put it down on the bedside table. "What are we going to do?" Julia demanded for the 100th time. The man in the corner said nothing, nor was there any interpretable sign on his ruin of a face. "What did you want her for, anyway? Or what did you want with her, anyway?" Julia is British in the film, so I'm doing British accent. She asked him, "You've spoiled everything." Or tried to do a British accent. "Spoiled," said the monster. "You don't know the meaning of spoiled." She swallowed her anger. His brooding unnerved her. We have to leave, Frank, she said, softening her tone. He threw a look across at her, white-hot ice. They'll come looking, she said. She'll tell them everything. Maybe. Don't you care? She demanded. The bandaged lump shrugged. Yes, he said, of course, but we can't leave, sweetheart. Sweetheart. The word mocked them both. A breath of sentiment in a room that had known only pain. I can't face the world like this. He gestured to his face. Can I? He said, staring up at her. Look at me. She looked. Can I? No. No, he went back to perusing the floor. I need a skin, Julia. A skin? Then maybe we can go dancing together. Isn't that what you want? He spoke of both dancing and death with equal nonchalance, as though one carried as little significance as the other. It calmed her, hearing him talk that way. How? She said at last, meaning how can a skin be stolen, but also how will our sanity survive? There are ways, said the flayed face, and blew her a kiss. Had it not been for the white walls, she might never have picked up the box. Had there been a picture to look at, a vase of sunflowers or a view of pyramids, anything to break the monotony of the room, she would have been content to stare at it and think. But the blankness was too much. It gave her no handhold on sanity. So she reached across to the table beside the bed and picked up the box. It was heavier than she remembered. She had to sit up in bed to examine it. There was little enough to see, no lid that she could find, no keyhole, no hinges. If she turned it over once, she turned it 100 times, finding no clue to how it might be opened. It was not solid, she was certain of that, so logic demanded that there be a way into it. But where? She tapped it, shook it, pulled and pressed it, all without result. It was not until she rolled over in bed and examined it in full glare of the lamp that she discovered some clue as to how the box was constructed. There were infinitesimal cracks in the sides of the box, where one piece of the puzzle abutted the next. They would have been invisible, but that a residue of blood remained in them, tracing the complex relation of the parts. Systematically, she began to feel her way over the sides, testing her hypothesis by pushing and pulling once more. The cracks offered her a general geography of the toy. Without them, she might have wandered the 6 sides forever, but the options were significantly reduced by the clues she'd found. There were only so many ways the box could be made to come apart. After a time, her patience was rewarded. A click, and suddenly one of the compartments was sliding out from beside its lacquered neighbors. Within there was beauty, polished surfaces which scintillated like the finest mother of pearl, colored shadows seeming to move in the gloss. And there was music, too. A simple tune emerged from the box, played on a mechanism that she could not yet see. Enchanted, she delved further. Though one piece had been removed, the rest did not come readily. Each segment presented a fresh challenge to fingers and mind, their victories rewarded with a further filigree added to the tune. She was coaxing the 4th section out by an elaborate series of turns and counter-turns when she heard the bell. She stopped working and looked up. Something was wrong. Either her weary eyes were playing tricks, or the blizzard-white walls had moved subtly out of true. She put down the box and slipped out of bed to go to the window. The bell still rang, a solemn tolling. She drew back the curtain a few inches. It was night and windy. Leaves migrated across the hospital lawn. Moths congregated in the lamplight. Unlikely as it seemed, the sound of the bell wasn't coming from outside. It was behind her. She let the curtain drop and turned back into the room. As she did so, the bulb in the bedside light guttered like a living flame. Instinctively, she reached for the pieces of the box. They and these strange events were intertwined somehow. As her hand found the fragments, the light blew out. She was not left in the darkness, however, nor was she alone. There was a soft phosphorescence at the end of the bed, and in its folds a figure. The condition of its flesh beggared her imagination. The hooks, the scars, yet its voice, when it spoke, was not that of a creature in pain. It's called the Le Marchand configuration, it said, pointing at the box. She looked down. The pieces were no longer in her hand, but floating inches above her palm. Miraculously, the box was reassembling itself without visible aid, the pieces sliding back together as the whole construction turned over and over. As it did so, she caught fresh glimpses of the polished interior and seemed to see ghosts' faces, twisted as if by grief or bad glass, howling back at her. Then all but one of the segments was sealed up, and the visitor was claiming her attention afresh. The box is a means to break the surface of the real, it said, a kind of invocation by which we Cenobites can be notified. Who? She said. You did it in ignorance, the visitor said. Am I right? Yes. It's happened before, came the reply, but there's no help for it. No way to seal the schism until we take what's ours. This is a mistake, she said. Don't try to fight. It's quite beyond your control. You have to accompany me. She shook her head. She'd had enough bullying nightmares to last her a lifetime. I won't go with you, she said. Damn you, I won't. As she spoke, the door opened. A nurse she didn't recognize, a member of the night shift presumably, was standing there. Did you call out? She asked. Kirsty looked at the Cenobite, then back at the nurse. They stood no more than a yard apart. She doesn't see me, it told her, nor hear me. I belong to you, Kirsty, and you to me. No, she said. Are you sure? Said the nurse. I thought I heard. Kirsty shook her head. It was lunacy. All lunacy. You should be in bed, the nurse chided. You'll catch your death, the Cenobite tittered. I'll be back in 5 minutes, said the nurse. Please go back to sleep. And she was gone again. We'd better go, it said. Leave them to their patchwork, eh? Such depressing places. You can't do this, she insisted. It moved toward her nevertheless, a row of tiny bells, depending from the scraggy flesh of its neck, tinkles as it approached. The stink it gave off made her want to heave. Wait, she said. No tears, please. It's a waste of good suffering. The box, she said in desperation. Don't you want to know where I got the box? Not particularly. Frank Cotton, she said. Does the name mean anything to you? Frank Cotton. The Cenobite smiled. Oh, yes, we know Frank. He solved the box, too, am I right? He wanted pleasure until we gave it to him. Then he squirmed. If I took you to him, he's alive, then? Very much alive. And you're proposing what? That I take him back instead of you? Yes, why not? Yes. The Cenobite moved away from her. The room sighed. I'm tempted, he said. Then, but perhaps you're cheating me. Perhaps this is a lie, to buy you time. I know where he is, for God's sake, she said. He did this to me. She presented her slashed arms for its perusal. If you're lying, it said, if you're trying to squirm your way out of this, I'm not. Deliver him alive to us, then. She wanted to weep with relief. Make him confess himself, and maybe we won't tear your soul apart. Chapter 11. Rory stood in the hallway and stared at Julia. His Julia. The woman he had once sworn to have and to hold till death did them part. It had not seemed such a difficult promise to keep at the time. He had idolized her for as long as he could remember, dreaming of her by night and spending the days composing love poems of wild ineptitude to her. But things had changed, and he had learned, as he watched them change, that the greatest torments were often the subtlest. Shane, what's up, man? Doing a little reading today. There had been times of late when he would have preferred a death by wild horses to the itch of suspicion that had so degraded his joy. Now, as he looked at her standing at the bottom of the stairs, it was impossible for him to even remember how good things had once been. All was doubt and dirt. One thing he was glad of, she looked troubled. Maybe that meant there was a confession in the air, indiscretions that she would pour out, and that he would forgive her for in a welter of tears and understanding. You look sad, he said. She hesitated, then said, It's difficult, Rory. What is? She seemed to want to give up before she began. What is? He pressed. I've so much to tell you. Her hand, he saw, was grasping the banister so tightly the knuckles burned white. I'm listening, he said. He would love her again if she'd just be honest with him. Tell me, he said. I think maybe it would be easier if I showed you, she told him, and so saying led him upstairs. The wind that harried the streets was not warm, to judge by the way the pedestrians drew their collars up and their faces down. But Kirsty didn't feel the chill. Was it her invisible companion who kept the cold from her, cloaking her with that fire the ancients had conjured to burn sinners in? Either that, or she was too frightened to feel anything. But then that wasn't how she felt. She wasn't frightened. The feeling in her gut was far more ambiguous. She had opened a door, the same door Rory's brother had opened. And now she was walking with demons. Yes, indeed, Shane. Yes, indeed. And at the end of her travels, she would have her revenge. She would find the thing that had torn her and tormented her, and make him feel the powerlessness that she had suffered. She would watch him squirm. More, she would enjoy it. Pain had made a sadist of her. As she made her way along Lodovico Street, she looked around for a sign of the Cenobite, but he was nowhere to be seen. Undaunted, she approached the house. She had no plan in mind. There were too many variables to be juggled. For one, would Julia be there? And if so, how involved in all this was she? Impossible to believe that she could be an innocent bystander, but perhaps she had acted out of terror of Frank. The next few minutes might furnish the answers. She rang the bell and waited. I'm a poop. Sup, I'm a poop. Trying not to stink up the chat, buddy. The door was answered by Julia, in her hand a length of white lace. Kirsty, she said. Oh, I'm sorry. She's British, so I'm supposed to be saying it in a British accent. Kirsty, she said, apparently unfazed by her appearance. It's late. Where's Rory? Were Kirsty's first words. They hadn't been quite what she'd intended, but they came out unbidden. He's here, Julia replied calmly, as if seeking to soothe the manic child. Is there something wrong? I'd like to see him, Kirsty answered. Rory? Yes. She stepped over the threshold without waiting for an invitation. Julia made no objection, but closed the door behind her. Only now did Kirsty feel the chill. She stood in the hallway and shivered. You look terrible, said Julia plainly. I was here this afternoon, she blurted. I saw what happened, Julia. I saw. What was there to see, came the reply. Her poise was unassailed. You know. Truly, I don't. I want to speak to Rory. Of course, came the reply. But take care with him, will you? He's not feeling very well. She led Kirsty through to the dining room. Rory was sitting at the table. There was a glass of spirits at his hand, a bottle beside it. Laid across an adjacent chair was Julia's wedding dress. The sight of it prompted recognition of the lace swath in her hand. It was the bride's veil. Rory looked much the worse for wear. There was dried blood on his face and at his hairline. The smile he offered was warm, but fatigued. What happened? She asked him. It's all right now, Kirsty, he said. His voice barely aspired to a whisper. Julia told me everything, and it's all right. No, she said, knowing that he couldn't possibly have the whole story. You came here this afternoon. That's right. That was unfortunate. You asked me, she glanced at Julia, who was standing at the door, then back at Rory. I did what I thought you wanted. Yes, I know. I'm only sorry you were dragged into this terrible business. You know what your brother's done, she said. You know what he summoned? I know enough. The point is, it's over now. What do you mean? Whatever he did to you, I'll make amends. What do you mean, over? He's dead, Kirsty. Deliver him alive, and maybe we won't tear your soul apart. Dead? We destroyed him, Julia and I. It wasn't so difficult. He thought he could trust me, you see. Thought that blood was thicker than water. Well, it isn't. I wouldn't suffer a man like that to live. She felt something twitch in her belly. Had the Cinemites got their hooks in her already, snagging the carpet of her bowels? You've been so kind, Kirsty, risking so much coming back here. There was something at her shoulder. Give me your soul, it said. I'll go to the authorities when I feel a little stronger. Try and find a way to make them understand. You killed him? She said. Yes. I don't believe it, she muttered. Take her upstairs, Rory said to Julia. Show her. Do you want to see? Julia inquired. Kirsty nodded and followed. It was warmer on the landing than below, and the air greasy and gray like filthy dishwater. The door to Frank's room was ajar. The thing that lay on the bare boards in a tangle of torn bandaging still steamed. His neck was clearly broken, head set askew on his shoulders. He was devoid of skin from head to foot. Kirsty looked away, nauseated. Satisfied? Julia asked. Kirsty didn't reply, but left the room and stepped on to the landing. At her shoulder, the air was restless. You lost, something said close by her. I know, she murmured. The bell had begun to rung, tolling for her, surely, and a turmoil of wings nearby, a carnival of carrion birds. She hurried down the stairs, praying that she wouldn't be overtaken before she reached the door. If they tore her heart out, let Rory be spared the sight. Let him remember her strong, with laughter on her lips, not please. Behind her, Julia said, Where are you going? When there was no reply forthcoming, she went on talking. Don't say anything to anybody, Kirsty, she insisted. We can't deal with this, Rory and me. Her voice had stirred Rory from his drink. He appeared in the hallway. The wounds Frank had inflicted looked more severe than Kirsty had first thought. His face was bruised in a dozen places, and the skin at his neck plowed up. As she came abreast of him, he reached out and took her arm. Julia's right, he said. Leave it to us to report, will you? There were so many things she wanted to tell him at that moment, but time left room for none. The bell was getting louder in her head. Someone had looped their entrails around her neck and was pulling the knot tight. It's too late, she murmured to Rory and pressed his hand away. What do you mean? He said to her as he covered the yards to the door. Don't go, Kirsty. Not yet. Tell me what you mean. She couldn't help but offer him a backward glance, hoping that he would find in her face all the regrets she felt. It's all right, he said sweetly, still hoping to heal her. Really, it is. He opened his arms. Come to Daddy, he said. The phrase didn't sound right out of Rory's mouth. Some boys never grew to be daddies, however many children they sired. Kirsty put out a hand to the wall to steady herself. It wasn't Rory who was speaking to her. It was Frank. Somehow, it was Frank. She held on to the thought through the mounting din of bells, so loud now that her skull seemed ready to crack open. Rory was still smiling at her, arms extended. He was talking too, but she could no longer hear what he said. The tender flesh of his face shaped the words, but the bells drowned them out. She was thankful for the fact. It made it easier to defy the evidence of her eyes. Paul, what's going on? Thanks, man. I know who you are, she said suddenly, not certain of whether her words were audible or not, but unquenchably sure that they were true. Rory's corpse was upstairs, left to lie in Frank's shunned bandaging. The usurped skin was now wed to his brother's body, the marriage sealed with the letting of blood. Yes, that was it. Okay. Hey. Left her body. Where was I? Okay. The coils around her throat were tightening. It could only be moments before they dragged her off in desperation. She started back along the hallway toward the thing in Rory's face. It's you, she said. The face smiled at her, undismayed. She reached out and snatched at him. Startled, he took a step backward to avoid her touch, moving with graceful sloth, but somehow still managing to avoid her touch. The bells were intolerable. They were pulping her thoughts, tolling her brain tissue to dust. At the rim of her sanity, she reached again for him, and this time he did not quite avoid her. Her nails raked the flesh of his cheek, and the skin so recently grafted slid away like silk. The blood-buttered meat beneath came into horrid view. Behind her, Julia screamed, and suddenly the bells weren't in Kirsty's head any longer. They were in the house, in the world. The hallway lights burned dazzlingly bright, and then, their filaments overloading, went out. There was a short period of total darkness, during which time she heard a whimpering that may or may not have come from her own lips. Hey, Tonk. Yeah, I could go and read the book again. At another time, that'd be cool. Just give me a follow, and we'll let you know if we want to go into it. I mean, it's still Halloween season, so I could definitely read the book again. It'll be around this time. Some Harry Potter. Ooh, that's a long read. All 7 books. Okay, sorry for those who are into the story. The hallway lights burned dazzlingly bright, and then their filaments overloading went out. There was a short period of total darkness, during which time she heard a whimpering that may or may not have come from her own lips. Then it was as if fireworks were spluttering into life in the walls and floor. The hallway danced. One moment, an abattoir, the walls running scarlet. The next, a boudoir, powder blue, canary yellow. The moment following that, a ghost train tunnel, all speed and sudden fire. By one flaring light, she saw Frank moving toward her, Rory's discarded face hanging from his jaw. She avoided his outstretched arms and ducked through into the front room. The hold onto her throat had relaxed, she realized. The Cenobites had apparently seen the error of their ways. Soon they would intervene, surely, and bring an end to this farce of mistaken identities. She would not wait to see Frank claimed, as she'd thought of doing. She'd had enough. Instead, she'd flee the house by the back door and leave them to it. Her optimism was short-lived. The fireworks in the hall threw some light ahead of her into the dining room, enough to see that it was already bewitched. There was something moving over the floor like ash before the wind, and chains cavorting into the air. Innocent she might be, but the forces loose here were indifferent to such trivialities. She sensed that to take another step would invite atrocities. Her hesitation put her back within Frank's reach, but as he snatched at her, the fireworks in the hallway faltered, and she slipped away from him under the cover of darkness. The respite was all too brief. New lights were already blooming in the hall, and he was after her afresh, blocking her route to the front door. Why didn't they claim him, for God's sake? Hadn't she brought them here as she'd promised and unmasked him? Frank opened his jacket. In his belt was a bloodied knife, doubtless the flaying edge. He pulled it out and pointed it at Kirsty. "From now on," he said as he stalked her, "I'm Rory." She had no choice but to back away from him. The door, escape, sanity, receding with every step. "Understand me. I'm Rory now, and nobody's ever going to know any better." Her heel hit the bottom of the stair, and suddenly there were other hands on her, reaching through the banisters and seizing fistfuls of her hair. She twisted her head around and looked up. It was Julia, of course, face slack, all passion consumed. She wrenched Christie's head back, exposing her throat as Frank's knife gleamed toward it. At the last moment, Kirsty reached up above her head and snatched hold of Julia's arm, wrenching her from her perch on the 3rd or 4th stair. Losing both her balance and her grip on her victim, Julia let out a shout and fell, her body coming between Kirsty and Frank's thrust. The blade was too close to be averted. It entered Julia's side to the hilt. She moaned, then she reeled away down the hall, the knife buried in her. Frank scarcely seemed to notice. His eyes were on Kirsty once again, and they shone with horrendous appetite. She had nowhere to go but up, the fireworks still exploding, the bells still ringing. She started to mount the stairs. Her tormentor was not coming in immediate pursuit, she saw. Julia's appeals for help had diverted him to where she lay, halfway between the stairs and front door. He drew the knife from her side. She cried out in pain as if to assist her. And, as if to assist her, he went down on his haunches beside her body. She raised her arm to him, looking for tenderness. In response, he cupped his hand beneath her head and drew her up toward him. As their faces came within inches of each other, Julia seemed to realize that Frank's intentions were far from honorable. She opened her mouth to scream, but he sealed her lips with his and began to feed. She kicked and scratched in the air, all in vain, tearing her eyes from the sight of this depravity. Kirsty crawled up to the head of the stairs. The second floor offered no real hiding place, of course, nor was there any escape route, except to leap from one of the windows. But having seen the cold comfort Frank had just offered his mistress, jumping was clearly the preferable option. The fall might break every bone in her body, but it would at least deprive the monster of further sustenance. The fireworks were fizzling out, it seemed. The landing was in smoky darkness. She stumbled along it rather than walked, her fingertips moving along the wall. Downstairs, she heard Frank on the move again. He was finished with Julia. Now he spoke as he began up the stairs, the same incestuous invitation. "Come to Daddy." It occurred to her that the Cenobites were probably viewing this chase with no little amusement, and would not act until there was only one player left, Frank. She was forfeit to their pleasure. Bastards, she breathed, and hoped they heard. She had almost reached the end of the landing. Ahead lay the junk room. Did it have a window sizable enough for her to climb through? If so, she would jump and curse them as she fell. Curse them all. God and the devil and whatever lay between cursed them as she dropped. Hope for nothing but that the concrete be quick with her. Frank was calling her again, and almost at the top of the stairs. She turned the key in the lock, opened the junk room door, and slipped through. Yes, there was a window. It was uncurtained, and moonlight fell through it in shafts of indecent beauty, illuminating a chaos of furniture and boxes. She made her way through the confusion to the window. It was wedged open an inch or two to air the room. She put her fingers under the frame and tried to heave it up far enough for her to climb out, but the sash in the window had rotted, and her arms were not equal to the task. She quickly hunted for a makeshift lever, and part of her mind coolly calculated the number of steps it would take take her pursuer to cover the length of the landing. Less than 20, she concluded, as she pulled a sheet off of one of the tea chests, only to find a dead man staring up at her from the chest, eyes wild. He was broken in a dozen places, arms smashed and bent back upon themselves, legs tucked up to his chin. As she went to cry out, she heard Frank at the door. "Where are you?" he inquired. She clamped her hand over her face to stop the cry of revulsion from coming. As she did so, the door handle turned. She ducked out of sight behind a felled armchair, swallowing her scream. The door opened. She heard Frank's breath, slightly labored, heard the hollow pad of his feet on the boards, then the sound of the door being pulled to again. It clicked. Silence. She waited for a count of 13, then peeped out of hiding, half expecting him to still be in the room with her, waiting for her to break cover, but no, he'd gone. Swallowing the breath her cry had been mounting upon had brought an unwelcome side effect. Hiccups. The first of them, so unexpected she had no time to subdue it, sounded gun-crack loud. But there was no returning step from the landing. Frank, it seemed, was already out of earshot. As she returned to the window, skirting the tea chest coffin, a second hiccup startled her. She silently reprimanded her belly, but in vain. A third and fourth came unbidden while she wrestled once more to lift the window. That, too, was a fruitless effort. It had no intention of compliance. Briefly, she contemplated breaking the glass and yelling for help, but rapidly discarded the idea. Frank would be eating out her eyes before the neighbors had even shaken off sleep. Instead, she retraced her steps to the door and opened it a creaking fraction. There was no sign of Frank, so far as her eyes were able to interpret the shadows. Cautiously, she opened the door a little wider and stepped onto the landing once again. The gloom was like a living thing. It smothered her with murky kisses. She advanced 3 paces without incident, then a fourth. On the 5th, her lucky number, her body took a turn for the suicidal. She hiccuped, her hand too tardy to reach for her mouth, before the din was out. This time, it did not go unheard. "There you are," said a shadow, and Frank slipped from the bedroom to block her path. He was vaster for his meal. He seemed as wide as the landing, and he stank of meat. With nothing to lose, she screamed blue murder as he came at her. He was unashamed by her terror. With inches between her flesh and his knife, she threw herself sideways and found that the fifth step had brought her abreast of Frank's room. She stumbled through the open door. He was after her in a flash, cowing his delight. There was a window in this room, she knew. She'd broken it herself mere hours before. But the darkness was so profound she might have been blindfolded, not even a glimmer of moonlight to feed her sight. Frank was equally lost, it seemed. He called after her in this pitch, the whine of his knife accompanying his call as he slit the air. Back and forth, back and forth. Stepping away from the sound, her foot caught in the tangle of the bandaging on the floor. Next moment she was toppling. It wasn't the boards she fell heavily upon, however, but the greasy bulk of Rory's corpse. It won a howl of horror from her. "There you are," said Frank. The knife slices were suddenly closer, inches from her head. But she was deaf to them. She had her arms about the body beneath her, and approaching death was nothing beside the pain she felt now touching him. "Rory," she moaned, content that his name be on her lips when the cut came. "That's right," said Frank. "Rory." Somehow the theft of Rory's name was as unforgivable as stealing his skin, or so her grief told her. A skin was nothing. Pigs had skins, snakes had skins. They were knitted of dead cells, shed and grown and shed again. But a name? That was a spell which summoned memories. She would not let Frank usurp it. "Rory's dead," she said. The words stung her, and with the sting the ghost of a thought. "Hush, baby," he told her. Suppose the Cenobites were waiting for Frank to name himself. Hadn't the visitor in the hospital said something about Frank confessing? "You're not Rory," she said. "We know that," came the reply, "but nobody else does." "Who are you, then?" "Poor baby. Losing your mind, are you? Good thing, too." "Who, though?" "It's safer that way." "Who?" "Hush, baby," he said. He was stooping to her in the darkness, his face within inches of hers. "Everything's going to be as right as rain. Yes?" "Yes. Frank's here, baby." "Frank?" "That's right. I'm Frank." So saying, he delivered the killing blow, but she heard it coming in the darkness and dodged its benediction. A second later, the bell began again, and the bare bulb in the middle of the room flickered into life. By it, she saw Frank beside his brother, the knife buried in the dead man's buttock. As he worked it out of the wound, he set his eyes on her afresh. Another chime, and he was up, and would have been at her, but for the voice. It said his name lightly, as if calling a child out to play. "Frank!" His voice dropped for the second time that night. A look of puzzlement flitted across it, and on its heels, horror. Slowly he turned his head around to look at the speaker. It was the Cenobite, its hooks sparkling. Behind it, Kirsty saw 3 other figures, their anatomies catalogues of disfigurement. Frank threw a glance at Kirsty. "You did this," he said. She nodded. "Get out of here," said one of the newcomers. "This isn't your business now." "Whore!" Frank screeched at her. "Bitch! Cheating fucking bitch!" The hail of rage followed her across the room to the door. As her palm closed around the door handle, she heard him coming after her, and turned to find that he was standing less than a foot from her, the knife a hair's breadth from her body. But there he was, fixed, unable to advance another millimeter. They had their hooks in him. The flesh of his arms and legs and curled through the meat of his face. Attached to the hooks, chains which they held taut. There was a soft sound as his resistance drew the barbs through his muscle. His mouth was dragged wide, his neck and chest plowed open. The knife dropped from his fingers. He expelled a last incoherent curse at her, his body shuddering now as he lost his battle with their chains upon him. Inch by inch, he was drawn back toward the middle of the room. "Go," said the voice of the Cenobite. She could see them no longer. They were already lost behind the blood-flecked air. Accepting their invitation, she opened the door, while behind her Frank began to scream. As she stepped onto the landing, plaster dust cascaded from the ceiling. The house was growling from basement to eaves. She had to go quickly. She knew before whatever demons were loose here shook the place apart. But though time was short, she could not prevent herself from snatching one look at Frank, to be certain that he would come after her no longer. He was in extremis, hooked through in a dozen or more places, flesh wounds gouged in him even as she watched, spread-eagled beneath the solitary bulb, body hauled to the limits of his endurance and beyond. He gave vent to shrieks that would have won pity from her had she not learned better. Suddenly, his cries stopped. There was a pause. And then in one last act of defiance, he cranked up his heavy head and stared at her, meeting her gaze with eyes from which all bafflement and all malice had fled. They glittered as they rested on her, pearls and all. In response, the chains were drawn an inch tighter, but the Cenobites gained no further cry from him. Instead, he put his tongue out at Kirsty and flicked it back and forth across his teeth in a gesture of unrepentant lewdness. Then he came unsown. His limbs separated from his torso and his head from his shoulders in a welter of bone shards and heat. She threw the door closed as something thudded against it from the other side. His head, she guessed. Then she was staggering downstairs, with wolves howling in the walls, and the bells in turmoil, and everywhere, thickening the air like smoke, the ghost of wounded birds sewn wingtip to wingtip, and lost to flight. She reached the bottom of the stairs and began along the hallway to the front door, but as she came within spitting distance of freedom, she heard somebody call her name. It was Julia. There was blood on the hall floor, marking a trail from the spot where Frank had abandoned her, through into the dining room. "Kirsty," she called again. It was a pitiable sound, and despite the wind-choked air, she could not help but go in pursuit of it, stepping through into the dining room. The furniture was smoldering charcoal. The ash that she'd glimpsed was a foul-smelling carpet, and there in the middle of this domestic wasteland sat a bride. By some extraordinary act of will, Julia had managed to put her wedding dress on and secure her veil upon her head. Now she sat in the dirt, the dress besmirched. But she looked radiant nevertheless, more beautiful indeed, for the fact of the ruin that surrounded her. "Help me," she said, and only now did Kirsty realize that the voice she heard was not coming from beneath the lush veil, but from the bride's lap. And now the copious folds of the dress were parting, and there was Julia's head, set on a pillow of scarlet silk and framed with a fall of auburn hair. Bereft of lungs, how could it speak? It spoke nevertheless. "Kirsty," it said. It begged and sighed and rolled back and forth in the bride's lap as if it hoped to unlodge its reason. Kirsty might have aided it, might have snatched the head up and dashed out its brains, but that the bride's veil had started to twitch, and was rising now, as if plucked at by invisible fingers. Beneath it, a light flickered and grew brighter and brighter yet, and with the light, a voice. "I am the engineer," it sighed. No more than that. Then the fluted folds rose higher, and the head beneath gained the brilliance of a minor sun. She did not wait for the blaze to blind her. Instead, she backed out into the hallway, the birds almost solid now, the wolves insane, and flung herself at the front door even as the hallway ceiling began to give way. The night came to meet her, a clean darkness. She breathed it in greedy gulps as she departed the house at a run. It was her second such departure. God help her sanity, that there ever be a third. At the corner of Lodovico Street, she looked back. The house had not capitulated to the forces unleashed within. It stood now quiet as a grave, no quieter. As she turned away, somebody collided with her. She yelped with surprise, but the huddled pedestrian was already hurrying away into the anxious murk that preceded morning. As the figure hovered on the outskirts of solidity, it glanced back, and its head flared in the gloom, a cone of white fire. It was the engineer. She had no time to look away. It was gone again in one instant, leaving its glamour in her eye. Only then did she realize the purpose of the collision. Le Marchand's box had been passed back to her and sat in her hand. Its surfaces had been immaculately resealed and polished to a high gloss. Though she did not examine it, she was certain there would be no clue to its solution left. The next discoverer would voyage its faces without a chart. And until such time was she elected its keeper? Apparently so. She turned it over in her hand. For the frailest of moments, she seemed to see ghosts in the lacquer, Julia's face, and that of Frank. She turned it over again, looking to see if Rory was held here, but no. Wherever he was, it wasn't here. There were other puzzles, perhaps, that if solved gave access to the place where he lodged. A crossword, maybe, whose solution would lift the latch of the Paradise Garden, or a jigsaw in the completion of which lay access to Wonderland. She would wait and watch, as she had always watched and waited, hoping that such a puzzle would one day come to her. But if it failed to show itself, she would not grieve too deeply, for fear that mending of broken hearts be a puzzle neither wit nor time had the skill to solve. That was The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. The book, or the short novella that inspired the Hellraiser movies. There is another book I'm going to be looking into getting. It's the continuation of this story, and then there is a book after that called The Scarlet Gospels, which I do have, which I intend to read at some point. But that takes care of this particular story, or this particular aspect of the story, or this particular episode of the story. I'm going to boogie out of here. This was kind of a short stream. Thanks to anyone who might have stopped by. Thanks for anyone who decided to participate in chat and all that good stuff. I will be back on most likely next weekend. Not sure if it's going to be gaming or reading or something like that, but I'll figure it out during the week. If you want to see, or if you want to hear the first half of this story, I have the stream should still be up on Twitch and Mixer if you want to check that out. My name is That Dante, that D4NT3. You can find me that Dante on Twitch and Mixer, of course, and Twitter is where I make updates. So if I'm going to be doing anything online, live streaming, I'll probably be posting it there. And I'm on a few other places, but blah, blah, blah. Anyway, friendos, I am out of here. You folks have a good rest of your Sunday. Enjoy the rest of your week. I may randomly get on. I've been playing the old game Return to Castle Wolfenstein. So I may be streaming that, playing that a little bit. It's a fun little old game. I'm out of here. You guys